The first alarm Amara Voss heard that morning was not the one she expected. She had been braced for the reactor alarm, the one that meant a coolant line had frozen solid somewhere in the lower deck. She had been braced for the hull alarm, the one that meant the patch on Section 9 had finally given up. What she got instead was a soft, almost polite chime from the medical bay, the kind of sound the station made when it wanted to tell you something without frightening you first. She was at Priest's cradle in 4 steps. The display above his stasis unit was doing something she had never seen it do. The power reading was full. Every cell in the bank was charged and steady. But the supply line gauge, the one that tracked the Thren's salt feeding his cradle's cooling jacket, sat at 0. Not low. 0. And beneath it, a small honest number was counting down. 14 hours. Then his body temperature would begin to climb, and there would be nothing in the jacket to stop it, and a man who had spent 9 years fixing other people's mistakes on the station would die from one that wasn't his. She checked the feed line herself, hands moving before her mind had finished catching up. The valve was open. The tank behind it was full of nothing. She had built that cooling jacket herself, 3 weeks ago, in the hours after Priest came through the airlock with half his chest burned through and a crew of 5 behind him who were alive only because he had stayed in the breach 4 seconds longer than any safety protocol allowed. She remembered the particular satisfaction of watching his temperature settle, watching the numbers on the display stop climbing and finally hold steady. She had let herself believe, for 3 weeks, that the hard part was over. Now she was looking at a countdown built from nothing but arithmetic, and the hard part had simply changed its shape. "Command, this is medical," she said into her wrist unit, keeping her voice flat because Priest could still hear things even in stasis, and panic traveled through a room whether you meant it to or not. "I need someone to tell me why my coolant supply just disappeared." It took Commander Iris Calloway 6 minutes to answer, which told Voss everything she needed to know before a single word was said, because Calloway never took 6 minutes for anything. "It's not just you," Calloway said. "It's everyone. Every station in the Reach. The ward cut the ration an hour ago. No warning. It's not a shortage. It's a decision." Voss looked at the countdown. 14 hours. Now 13:58. "Then we need a new decision," she said. "Fast." She did not wait for Calloway to answer before she was already moving, pulling up a schematic of the cradle's cooling jacket on the nearest console, running through the compound's known properties in her head the way she had run through 100 other problems on this station that had no clean textbook solution. Thermal conductivity. Storage stability. Flow behavior under pressure. Somewhere in that list of requirements was a substitute, she was certain of it, because there always had been before, on a station that had spent 9 years solving problems nobody upstream had thought worth solving for them. "Get me Ren," she said into her wrist unit, "and pull every waste stream schematic we've got for this station. If Thren Salt does 4 things well, I want to know what else on this station does even 2 of them adequately. We'll improve the rest as we go." "You're going to try to replace it," Calloway said. It wasn't a question either. "I'm going to try everything," Voss said. "Replacing it is just the first everything." 3 days earlier, in an office on the Custodial Ward's administrative platform, an auditor named Iltikes had reviewed the consumption reports for the Kestrel Reach cluster and felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of a number that finally made sense. Kes was Colvin, and Colvin did not read faces the way humans did. They read the floor. Every Colvin-built environment carried a faint resonance underfoot, a language of vibration too subtle for most species to notice, and Kes had spent 30 years learning to hear the difference between a room where people believed what they were saying and a room where they didn't. It was, she often thought, a better lie detector than any expression could ever be. Faces could be arranged. Flaws could not. She had joined the ward's auditing corps at an age when most Colvin were still finishing their second education cycle, drawn less by ambition than by a genuine fascination with the mechanics of how large systems held together, or failed to. 30 years in, she had audited compliance on 11 different worlds, watched species rise and fall out of favor with the assembly, and had come, without quite noticing the process happening, to trust numbers more than she trusted intentions. Numbers did not flatter anyone. Numbers simply were. The Kestrel Reach report had been, by that standard, a small comfort. A species she had never fully understood was finally behaving the way the ward's models predicted a young civilization should behave under pressure. It was, she thought at the time, almost reassuring. The report in front of her told a simple story. The human stations along the Reach were consuming Thren salt at nearly 4 times the rate the ward had projected when it first extended provisional supply rights to them. The salt kept human medical cradles cold enough to hold a dying body in careful suspension while it healed. It also, less charitably, let the humans expand faster than any species the ward had integrated in the last 100 years, because a species that could stabilize its injured indefinitely could take risks other species couldn't afford. Senior Warden Athalossan had put it to the assembly in 4 words that Kess still remembered exactly, because the floor beneath the assembly chamber had trembled with the particular steadiness of a man who fully believed what he was saying. "They lean on us," he had said. "Let's see them stand." The vote to cut the human ration by 90%, effective immediately, had passed without much debate. Kess had voted for it. She had told herself it was a reasonable test of a young species' resilience, the kind of pressure every civilization eventually had to prove it could bear. She had been sent to the Reach to observe the results, and to bring back a recommendation. She had expected to find desperation. Bellwood Station, the largest of the Kestrel Reach outposts, had the particular look of a place built by people who had run out of the right materials a long time ago and had simply kept going anyway. The corridors were a patchwork of 3 different hull alloys, each section a slightly different shade of grey, like geological strata marking eras of scarcity and repair. The lighting rigs had been rewired so many times that no 2 junctions looked alike. Somewhere behind a bulkhead a pump was cycling with a faint, a rhythmic clunk that suggested a part long overdue for replacement and never quite urgent enough to justify the wait. And yet the air was clean, the gravity plating hummed evenly under Kess's boots, and nothing rattled when the docking clamps engaged. Whatever this station lacked in uniformity, it did not lack in competence. Kess noted this the way she noted everything, quietly, filing it against the report she had not yet begun to write. Commander Calloway met her at the airlock alone, which Kess noted. No honor guard, no prepared statement, no attempt to perform calm for the visiting official. Just a tired woman in a station uniform with grease on one cuff, who looked at Kess the way you look at whether you've already decided to work around. "Auditor Kess," Calloway said. "You're here to watch us run out." "I am here to observe the consequences of the ration adjustment," Kess said. "Whatever they turn out to be." Calloway's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sure. Come on. I'll show you the consequences." They walked through the station's central corridor, past a mess hall where 2 crew members were arguing amiably over a hydroponic schedule, past a maintenance alcove where someone had left a half-finished repair with a note taped to it reading back in 20, gone to eat, and past a young engineer, barely out of training by the look of her, running with a toolkit under one arm toward the lower decks without breaking to explain herself to anyone she passed. Nobody stopped the young woman to ask where she was going or whether she was authorized to go there. Calloway simply stepped aside to let her through, without appearing to register it as unusual at all. "Does no one require permission to move through this station with urgency?" Kess asked. "If Nadia's running, something needs doing," Calloway said, not slowing her own pace. "You'll learn the faces eventually, if you stay long enough. You stop needing to ask who's authorized and start just watching who's moving fast, and toward what. It tells you more than any manifest ever will." Kess filed this observation beside the others, aware even as she did it that her private list was growing longer than anything her formal report would eventually be able to hold. She led Kess not to an office, not to a conference room, but directly to the medical bay, where a man named Priest lay in a stasis cradle with a countdown running above his head. Kess felt the floor here differently than she had felt it in the corridor. Tighter. Held. "This is Priest," Calloway said. "Hull technician. Took a plasma burn across the chest 3 weeks ago, sealing a breach that would have killed 11 people if he hadn't. He's been in that cradle healing ever since. 12 more hours of cooling and he walks out of here on his own legs. Your order took the cooling away this morning." The order was not directed at any individual, Kess said, because it was true, and because she had learned that saying true things steadily was usually the safest thing to say. "I know that," Calloway said. "He doesn't care. His body doesn't care. That's kind of the problem with orders that aren't directed at anyone. They still land on somebody." Kess looked at the countdown. 12 hours, 6 minutes. "What will you do?" Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and Kess felt the floor beneath the other woman's boots, steady in a way that unsettled her more than fear would have. Fear she understood. This was something else. "We are going to fix it," Calloway said. "Amara's already on it. Come meet her, if you want to actually see what happens instead of just filing a report about it." The workshop that Dr. Amara Voss had claimed for herself was 1 deck down from medical, a converted parts bay with 3 work tables pushed together and a wall of shelving that held, as far as Kes could tell, absolutely nothing organized by any system a ward auditor would recognize. Voss was standing at the center table with a disassembled Stasis cradle jacket in front of her, sleeves pushed up, and she did not look up when Kes and Calloway came in. "Ilta Kes," Calloway said. "Ward auditor." "I know who she is," Voss said, still not looking up. "I read the ration notice. It had her department's authorization code on it." "I did not write the order," Kes said. "Didn't say you did." Voss finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake for longer than her body wanted to admit. "You want to understand something, auditor? Ask me the right question. Everyone from the ward always asks the wrong one." "What is the wrong question?" "How will you survive without the salt?" Voss said it in a flat imitation of formal ward cadence that made Calloway's mouth twitch again. "That's the question you people always ask. It assumes the salt is the thing that's keeping him alive. It isn't. The salt is just the thing we've been using to do the job. The job is keeping a wound cold and stable while a body heals itself. There's more than one way to do a job." Kes considered this. The floor beneath Voss's boots held the particular steadiness of someone stating a fact she had already tested, not a hope she was still auditioning. "You believe you can replace the compound." "I believe," Voss said, turning back to the disassembled jacket, "that Thren salt is a good conductor of cold, and a stable compound, and easy to store, and that is exactly why nobody on this station has spent 5 minutes in the last 9 years trying to find anything else. Why would we? It worked. Now it doesn't work, so." She shrugged, the specific shrug of an engineer who had already stopped being surprised by the universe some years ago. "Now we find out what else works." "You have 12 hours, Kes said. It was not a challenge. It was, she realized as she said it, closer to a genuine question about whether that was enough time. 11:40, Voss said, checking a display without breaking rhythm. "You want to help or you want to observe? Because I don't actually care which, but pick one, we are a little busy." The first test of the prototype jacket failed within 20 minutes. A junction seal, never designed for a slurry that thick, split under pressure and sprayed a thin line of dark, foul-smelling fluid across the work table and Voss's forearm. Voss did not shout. She looked at the split seal for exactly 2 seconds, said a single short word Kes's translator declined to render, and reached for a different gauge of tubing without breaking stride, as though the failure had simply confirmed something she already suspected rather than surprised her at all. "That's one," Wren called from across the room, not looking up from his own work. "That's one," Voss agreed. "Get me the wider bore fitting. If the seal can't hold the pressure, we widen the channel and slow the flow rate instead of fighting the seal." The second attempt held for closer to an hour before a slow clog began forming at a 90-degree bend in the tubing, the granular slurry settling exactly where the flow changed direction, and Voss diagnosed it from the temperature readout alone, before the physical blockage had even fully formed, and rerouted the design around a gentler curve that cost her 15 minutes and, this time, worked. Kes found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to know the answer to a question that had nothing to do with her assignment. "What are you trying instead?" Voss held up a length of narrow tubing packed with something dark and granular that Kes didn't recognize. "Ferroslurry. It's a waste byproduct from the water reclamation filters. Nobody's ever used it for thermal transfer because it's messier and it clogs if you don't pump it right. But it holds cold almost as well as Thren salt if you keep it moving. And we have about 400 litres of it sitting in a reclamation tank 2 decks down that nobody's rationing because nobody at the ward thinks of it as anything but sludge." Kes looked at the tubing. Then she looked at the countdown. 11 hours, 39 minutes. "You built this in the last hour." "I started thinking about it in the last hour," Voss said. "Ren over in engineering already had a pump modification half drafted from some completely unrelated project 2 years ago. Took him 11 minutes to adapt it once I told him what I needed. That's the part people never account for. Nobody's starting from nothing. Everybody's always already halfway to something." "It smells terrible," Kes said, before she could stop herself, because the granular slurry had a sharp mineral odor that her translator did not have a polite word for. "It smells like a swamp that's given up on itself," Voss agreed, not looking up. "Ren threw up the first time we pumped it through in a closed loop. Didn't stop him working. He just did it from a slightly greater distance after that." A voice from across the workshop, presumably Ren, said something short and aggrieved that the translator rendered only as a firm objection to that account of events, and Voss's mouth twitched in something that was almost, despite everything, a real smile. Point is, it's ugly and it stinks and nobody would ever choose it if they had a choice. We don't have a choice today. So today it's beautiful. Kess said nothing for a moment. The floor of the workshop, beneath 4 sets of boots now, held a quality she was starting to associate specifically with this species, and specifically with this kind of room. Not confidence exactly. Something with more friction in it. Determination that expected to fail 6 times before it worked, and had already decided that was an acceptable price. Second thing, Calloway said, glancing at a message on her own wrist unit. Thomas is asking for authorization to route 40 kilos of scrap alloy out to Harrow Station on the next supply run. Says it's urgent. Voss didn't look up. Approve it. You know what it's for. No idea, Voss said. But if Thomas is asking for it, someone on Harrow needs it for something that matters, and I trust that a lot more than I trust knowing the details. That is not how resource allocation is meant to function, Kess said, before she could stop herself. No, Voss agreed cheerfully, already turning back to the cooling jacket in front of her. It really isn't. You should see how we do inventory. Kess made a note, mostly for herself, to remember the name Thomas Reyes. By the 2nd hour of her observation, Kess had begun keeping a private list, and by the 4th hour, the list had stopped making sense to her in the way she expected it to. She had come to Bellwood Station braced to witness rationing, hoarding, the quiet and understandable selfishness of people facing scarcity. She had seen exactly none of that. What she had seen instead was Voss's ferro-slurry prototype fail twice, get rebuilt twice, and on the 3rd attempt hold a stable 4 degrees below the threshold priest's cradle required, at which point Voss had said something under her breath that Kess's translator rendered only as an expression of profound and specific relief, and then immediately turned to the next problem, because the prototype worked for 1 cradle and there were 14 more on the station that needed the same fix by morning. What unsettled Kess was not the ingenuity. She had read enough ward history to know that scarcity produced ingenuity in almost every species eventually. What unsettled her was the absence of anyone directing it. No one had ordered Wren to adapt his pump design. No one had ordered Thomas Reyes to request scrap alloy for a station 200 kilometers away. No one, as far as Kess could determine by asking 4 separate people the same question in 4 separate ways, was in charge of solving the coolant problem for the Kestrel Reach cluster as a whole. Calloway commanded the station. Voss ran engineering and medical. Neither of them had issued a directive to the other stations. And yet, when Kess pulled the open communication logs that evening, she found that Harrow Station had already requested the same scrap alloy specification independently, 6 hours before Thomas's request went out, and that a station called Dunmore, 3 systems away, had posted an open question to a shared engineering channel asking whether anyone had tried ferro-slurry for thermal transfer. 4 hours before Voss had said the word out loud to Kess in the workshop. They didn't tell each other, Kess said to Calloway that night, in the commander's small office, which held nothing decorative on its walls except a hand-drawn chart of the station's water systems that looked older than the station's official records. There is no shared authority coordinating this. And yet the same solution is appearing on stations that have had no contact with each other in the last 12 hours. They didn't need to tell each other, Calloway said. They all had the same problem. Most of them have talked to each other about 100 other problems over the years. Everybody already half knows what everybody else is working on. When something this big hits, the channels that already exist just start carrying more traffic. Nobody built a plan for this. The plan was already there, in the shape of everybody already knowing each other. She thought of her private list again that night, reviewing it alone in the guest quarters. It had started, on the first day, as a simple record of observed non-compliance behaviors, the kind of list a ward auditor was trained to keep. By the 4th entry it had stopped being that. It had become, without her quite deciding to let it, a record of small unexplainable kindnesses, a technician staying 2 hours past shift change to help a team she wasn't assigned to. A message relayed across 3 people and 11 hours that turned out to be exactly the right message, sent to exactly the right person, for reasons none of the 3 people relaying it had ever been told. A supply request approved on nothing but a name she trusted. None of it fit inside a compliance framework. All of it, somehow, fit together. Kess turned this over slowly, the way she turned over most things that didn't fit her existing categories. On my world, she said, a crisis of this scale would require the ward to convene, assess, authorize, and distribute a solution downward through the hierarchy. That process, done efficiently, takes weeks. It is not a flaw in the process. It is deliberate. It exists so that a bad idea is caught before it spreads, so that one station's mistake does not become every station's mistake. Sure, Calloway said. And I get why that matters to you. But look at what it costs. While your assembly is convening its second meeting to discuss whether Pharaoh's slurry is worth investigating, Priest's temperature is still climbing. The caution isn't free. Somebody pays for it. Usually it's the person lying in the cradle, not the person sitting in the meeting. Here it's taking hours instead, Calloway said. And I know what you want to say next, that it's because we are smarter than you. It's not that. I've had this conversation with ward officials before, and they always want the answer to be about being smarter. It isn't. It's because we don't wait for the room to agree before we start trying things. Somebody tries something badly, somebody else improves it, and by the time your official channel would have finished its first meeting, we've already field tested 4 attempts and thrown out 3 of them. That sounds, Kess said carefully, inefficient. It's incredibly inefficient, Calloway agreed. Right up until it isn't. Then it's the fastest thing in the galaxy. Kess looked at the hand-drawn water chart on the wall. Who made this? No idea, Calloway said. It was already here when I took command. Somebody just kept adding to it. That's most of what you're looking at on this station, Auditor. Nobody built the whole thing. Everybody added a piece, and it kept holding. That night, Kess did not sleep in the guest quarters she had been assigned. She sat instead in the workshop, watching Voss and 2 other engineers she hadn't been introduced to work through the 5th and 6th cradles, and she found herself doing something she had not done in a professional capacity in over a decade. She found herself hoping they would succeed. The supply bay on Bellwood Station was tucked behind a door that had lost its label at some point in the station's history, and Kess found it only because she asked 3 separate people where she could find the man named Thomas Reyes, and all 3 pointed, without hesitation, in exactly the same direction. Reyes turned out to be a narrow, unhurried man somewhere in his 50s, sitting on an upturned crate surrounded by manifests, sorting through a pile of salvaged components with the patient thoroughness of someone who had done this exact task 10,000 times and still hadn't gotten bored of it. He looked up when Kess entered, unsurprised, as though visiting ward auditors was simply one more category of shipment he occasionally had to process. "You're the one asking about the alloy request," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am told you authorized 40 kilos of scrap alloy for shipment to Harrow Station on nothing more than a request relayed by Dr. Voss," Kess said. "I would like to understand your reasoning." Reyes set down the component in his hand. "There isn't much reasoning to it, honestly. Amara said Okafor over on Dunmore needed it, and needed it fast, and didn't have time to explain why. That's usually enough for me." That seems like a significant risk to take on incomplete information. Does it? Reyes considered this seriously, the way Kess was coming to realize most of the humans on this station considered most things, without performance, without haste. "I've been running supply on this station for 16 years, Auditor. In that time, I have never once had someone ask me for something urgently, for a reason they didn't have time to explain, and turn out to be wrong about needing it. Not once. People here don't cry emergency over nothing. There isn't room for that. If Amara says it's urgent, then somewhere down the line, whatever gets built with that alloy is going to matter to somebody. I don't need to know who before I decide it's worth sending. And if you are eventually wrong, then I'll have wasted 40 kilos of scrap," Reyes said, with a shrug that suggested he had already weighed exactly this outcome and found it entirely tolerable. "Compare that to what it costs if I sit on it for 2 days waiting for a form to clear approvals, and it turns out somebody needed it yesterday. I've made that mistake before, a long time ago, back before I understood how this place actually works. Cost a station 4 days it didn't have. I don't make it twice." Kess looked at the manifest spread across the crate, hundreds of small requests, most of them, she suspected, no more formally justified than the one to Harrow had been. "You do this constantly. Not only in a crisis." "Every day," Reyes said. "This is just the first time you've been standing here to see it." Kess thought about the ward's own supply protocols, the layered chain of authorization required to move even routine materials between administrative platforms, each layer built, in theory, to prevent exactly the kind of error Reyes had just described accepting without apparent concern. She thought about how long that chain would have taken to move 40 kilos of alloy across 200 kilometers, and set the number against the hours the actual transfer had required, and found the comparison uncomfortable enough that she did not immediately say it out loud. "Thank you," she said instead, "for your time." A chime sounded from the console beside him before Kes had reached the door, and Reyes glanced at it without hurrying, the way a man glances at whether he has already decided how to dress for. "Speaking of," he said, "Dunmore again. They want another 60 kilos of the same alloy, plus whatever spare filtration mesh we can spare." He was already keying the approval as he spoke, not waiting for Kes's reaction, though he seemed to sense it anyway. "Same reasoning as before, auditor. Somebody down there needs it, and I trust the person who's asking more than I trust waiting to find out why." "You do not find this arrangement precarious," Kes said. "You are, in effect, running a supply network across an entire cluster of stations on nothing more than accumulated trust in specific individuals." Precarious. Reyes tried the word out slowly, as though weighing whether it fit. "Maybe. But auditor, every system's precarious somewhere. Yours is precarious at the top, where one bad decision from someone with a lot of authority can cost 14 stations 2 weeks they don't have. Mine's precarious in the middle, where I might occasionally send someone 40 kilos of scrap they didn't strictly need. I know which kind of precarious I'd rather live inside." Kes thought about that for the rest of the walk back to the workshop, and did not entirely stop thinking about it for the remainder of her time on Bellwood Station. By the 4th day, the ferro-slurry conversion had reached every cradle on Bellwood Station, and Priest had opened his eyes for the first time in 3 weeks, groggy and confused and asking, in a rasping voice, whether anyone had fed his cat, which turned out to be a joke, because he did not have a cat, and the room had laughed harder than the joke deserved because everyone in it needed to laugh at something. Kes sent her first field report to the ward that evening. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied, and even then she was not fully satisfied, because the report kept wanting to say something she did not yet have the professional vocabulary to justify. What she eventually sent read, in part, "The ration adjustment has not produced the anticipated compliance pressure. Kestrel reach stations have independently converted medical cooling systems to a non-ration substitute compound within approximately 18 hours of the order's implementation, without central coordination between stations. Recommend immediate reassessment of the assumption that resource dependency constitutes meaningful leverage over this species." Senior Warden Ossen's response arrived less than a day later, and it was shorter than Kes expected, and colder. "One station's improvisation is not proof of systemic resilience. Continue observation. The ward's position is unchanged." Kes read the message twice, and then did something she had never done in 30 years of ward service. She requested, on her own authority, transport to a second station, and then a third, without waiting for approval. The transit shuttle between Bellwood and Harrow took 11 hours, and Kes spent most of it reviewing consumption data that no longer told her anything she did not already suspect. She found herself, somewhere in the 6th hour, watching the shuttle's own hull plating flex almost imperceptibly against the pressure differential outside, and thinking about how much of what she had seen at Bellwood depended on exactly that kind of small, continuous, unglamorous tolerance for imperfection. Nothing on that station had been built once and left alone. Everything had been built, used until it failed a little, patched, and used again. It was not, she was beginning to understand, a symptom of poverty. It was a method. Harrow Station announced itself long before the shuttle docked, a tight cluster of agricultural domes strung along a central spine, lit from within by rows of growing lights that turned the whole structure a faint, warm amber against the dark. Priyanka Solis met her at the airlock with the brisk, slightly distracted energy of someone who had been interrupted mid-task and intended to return to it as soon as this conversation was over. What Kes found in Harrow's medical bay was the ferro-slurry conversion, already running, refined further than Bellwood's own version, with a filtration improvement that Voss's team hadn't thought of yet, developed independently because Solis had access to a slightly different grade of scrap filtration mesh than Bellwood did, salvaged from an old irrigation system nobody had used in years. "You heard about the Bellwood approach secondhand," Kes said. "Through what channel, precisely?" "Precisely." Solis laughed, not unkindly. "There isn't a precisely, auditor. Somebody on a supply run mentioned it to somebody in my crew, who mentioned it to me over dinner. I asked 2 follow-up questions, decided the physics made sense, and started building that same night. If you're looking for a formal transmission record, you won't find one. It was a conversation. We have a lot of those." The journey to Dunmore took longer than either previous leg, 3 full days through a stretch of the reach where the stars thinned and the shuttle's own systems seemed to hum more quietly, as though even the machinery understood it was moving through emptier space. Dunmore, when it finally resolved out of the dark, looked older and more battered than either Bellwood or Harrow, it hull scarred with the pitted evidence of decades spent at the very edge of the ward's charted territory, and Kess found herself, against her own expectations, feeling something like relief when the docking clamps finally engaged. What she found at Dunmore Station, 3 systems out, was something else entirely. Dunmore's chief engineer, a quiet man named Aidan Okafor, had not converted his cradles to ferro slurry at all. He had redesigned the cooling jacket itself, removing the need for a circulating coolant compound altogether, using a passive heat exchange lattice built from repurposed hull plating offcuts that bled excess heat directly into the station's exterior shell. It was, by Kess's own technical assessment, a better design than the original Thren salt system had ever been. It required no consumable compound at all. It could not be rationed, restricted, or withheld by anyone, ever again, because there was nothing left to withhold. About 2 days, Okafor said. Would have taken longer, but Thomas Reyes over on Bellwood sent me 40 kilos of the right alloy before I'd even finished asking for it. Said Amara told him to trust it mattered without knowing why. Kess stood very still. You were telling me, she said slowly, that a supply clerk on a different station sent you critical materials for a design he did not yet know existed, based on nothing but a request relayed through a third party. That's about the size of it, Okafor said. Look, auditor, I don't know how to explain this in a way that'll make sense to your report format. Nobody planned this the way you're used to things being planned. But somebody needed something, and somebody else had it, and the distance between those 2 facts turned out to be about 11 hours instead of 11 weeks. That's not a conspiracy. That's just what happens when nobody's waiting for permission. Kess walked the length of the ladder system slowly, running one hand along the repurposed hull plating offcuts, feeling for herself the faint, steady warmth bleeding outward into the station's exterior shell, a wound in the wall that had been turned, deliberately, into a permanent exhaust for a problem that no longer needed to exist. You understand what you have built, she said. This is not a substitute for the ration. This is the end of the ration mattering at all, for this station, permanently. I understand it, Okafor said. Didn't build it to make a point, though. I built it because I had a coolant deadline and a scrapyard, and those were the 2 things I actually had to work with. Whatever point it makes on its own. I just wanted my patient stable. And yet the point exists, Kess said. Okafor considered this for a moment, wiping a smear of grease from his hands with a rag that had clearly cleaned 100 other things before this. Yeah, he said finally. I suppose it does. Didn't think about it that way until you said it out loud. Guess that's usually how it goes, though. Most of the biggest things people build, they weren't trying to build a statement. They were just trying to solve the thing directly in front of them. The statement just comes along for the ride, whether you meant it to or not. Kess returned to Bellwood Station on the 6th day with a private message from Senior Warden Osson waiting in her queue, marked with an urgency flag she had only seen used twice before in her career. Field reports from 3 additional stations confirmed the pattern you described. It read, The Assembly is concerned this represents a coordinated act of defiance disguised as improvisation. Determine whether Commander Calloway or Dr. Voss are directing a cross-station resistance network. This is now a security assessment, not a resource audit. Kess sat with the message for a long time before she answered it, because she understood, reading it, exactly what Osson wanted her to find, and exactly how badly he wanted the human's response to be something the ward could name and therefore punish. A resistance network had leaders. A resistance network could be arrested, tried, dismantled. A resistance network was, in a strange way, comforting, because it fit inside categories the ward already knew how to handle. What Kess had actually found did not fit inside any category the ward possessed. She went to Voss directly, because she had stopped believing that going around people got her closer to the truth than going through them. The ward believes you are directing a coordinated resistance, Kess said, across all 14 stations. They believe you and Commander Calloway designed this response as a unified act of defiance. Voss laughed, one short exhausted syllable with no humor in it at all. I've been awake for something like 60 of the last 70 hours keeping one man alive with sludge from a water filter. I haven't had a conversation with anyone on Dunmore in about 4 months. Tell your warden that if he wants to believe I'm secretly running 14 stations from a parts closet, he can come here and watch me not sleep and decide for himself how likely that looks. I believe you, Kes said, and meant it, and was faintly surprised to find that she did. But I need to understand what I am supposed to write instead. My superiors require a mechanism, an explanation with a shape they can act on. If there is no leader, no plan, no directive, then what, precisely, am I recommending they respond to? Voss set down the tool she was holding and looked at Kes properly for the first time since they'd met, the exhaustion in her face settling for a moment into something more deliberate. You keep asking who's in charge, Voss said. That's the wrong question, and I think some part of you already knows that, or you wouldn't keep coming back to ask it differently. Nobody's in charge of this, auditor, because it isn't a plan. It's just what happens when you take something a lot of ordinary, tired, overworked people actually need, and you tell them they can't have it anymore. They don't wait for a leader to tell them what to do. They just start doing the next obvious thing, badly, immediately, and they tell the person next to them what they tried, and that person tries something slightly better, and it spreads because it's useful, not because anyone ordered it to spread. You cut off the tap. So we stopped needing the tap. There's no conspiracy in that. There's just people. That is not a sentence I can put in a security assessment, Kes said quietly. No, Voss agreed. I imagine it isn't. That evening, Senior Warden Ossen contacted her directly, his image resolving above her wrist unit in the small guest quarters, sharp and formal even at this distance, the floor of his own office, transmitted faintly through the connection, carrying a rigidity Kes had heard in his voice for 30 years and had, until recently, never questioned. Auditor Kes, he said, I understand you have located the individuals responsible for the coordination. I have located the individuals building the redesigns, Kes said carefully. I have found no coordination to speak of. Then you have not looked hard enough. Ossen's voice did not rise, which was, Kes had learned long ago, always the more dangerous register for him. 14 stations do not independently arrive at compatible solutions within days of one another by accident. Auditor. Somewhere in that cluster is a mind directing this. Find it. With respect, Warden, I have spent 9 days looking for exactly that mind, and I have found only tired engineers and a supply clerk who trusts his colleagues more than he trusts a form. If you require a villain for this report, I am not able to manufacture one that fits the facts. The silence on the connection lasted long enough that Kes wondered if it had dropped. When Ossen spoke again, his voice had lowered, and something in it, for just a moment, sounded less like authority and more like a man standing at the edge of a conclusion he did not want to reach. Then perhaps, he said, the frightening part was never that they are hiding something from us, Auditor. Perhaps it is that there is nothing left to find. He ended the connection before Kes could answer, and she sat for a long time afterward in the quiet of the guest quarters, turning the sentence over, surprised to find that for once, she and the senior warden appeared to have arrived, from opposite directions, at exactly the same place. She did not sleep well that night. She kept returning, in the half-formed way thoughts return when a mind refuses to fully rest, to the image of the empty Thren salt tank she had seen on her first morning at Bellwood, the one Voss's team had drained without ceremony the moment it stopped mattering. She wondered, lying awake in the dark, how many other tanks across how many other worlds the ward had assumed were load-bearing, structurally essential to some dependent species of survival, when in fact they had simply never been tested to see whether they were load-bearing at all. She thought, before she began writing, about the first lesson every ward auditor was given during training, decades ago, on a world she now rarely thought of at all, that the purpose of the audit was never to decide what should be true, only to record what was. She had believed that distinction was simple, once. She was no longer certain it was, because what she had found on the Kestrel Reach kept resisting the plain, procedural language her training had given her for recording it, and she suspected, uncomfortably, that the resistance itself was information, if she was willing to sit with it long enough to understand what it was telling her. Kes wrote the report anyway, on the 7th day, sitting alone in the guest quarters she had barely used, and it took her 4 attempts, the same as her first message had, because every version she drafted kept trying to say something larger than the sentence in front of it. The version she finally sent read. There is no leadership structure directing the human response across Kestrel Reach. There is no evidence of coordinated defiance in any legal sense the ward recognizes. What exists instead is a pattern I have observed independently at 3 stations with no direct contact between them. When a resource the species depends on is withheld, the response is not hoarding, and it is not collapse. It is redesign, beginning almost immediately, spreading through informal channels of trust between individuals who already knew and helped each other before the crisis began. The Dunmore Station's engineering team has now produced a cooling system requiring no consumable compound whatsoever, rendering the original ration irrelevant to that station permanently. I assess that this design will spread to the remaining 11 stations within days, whether or not the ward restores the Thren salt supply. The ration has not produced compliance. It has produced independence. I recommend the ward consider what will happen the next time it attempts to use a resource dependency as leverage against a species that appears constitutionally incapable of remaining dependent on anything for very long. She sent it before she could soften the final line, because she had learned, in the last week, that softening the true thing rarely made it less true, only less useful. The 6 hours that followed were, by Kess's own private accounting, among the longest of her career. She did not leave the observation deck. She watched 2 supply shuttles depart for stations she had not yet visited, watched a maintenance crew replace a warp section of viewport seal with the same unhurried, uncomplaining competence she had come to expect from everyone on the station, and found herself, more than once, rehearsing what she would say if the ward simply reassigned her outright and sent someone more pliable to finish the audit in her place. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not much care if they did. The report was already sent. Whatever happened to her afterward would not unwrite it. She thought, before the reply came, about the 11 other species the ward had integrated during her career, and how in every one of those cases, resource leverage had eventually worked, more or less, to bend a young civilization's growth into a shape the assembly found manageable. It had worked so consistently, over so many decades, that no one still serving on the assembly had ever had reason to ask what would happen the day it didn't. She was, she realized, standing at the edge of exactly that day, and she found she did not feel the alarm she might have expected to feel. She felt something closer to the sensation of a held breath finally released. Senior Warden Ossen's reply came 6 hours later, and this time it was long, and Kess read it standing at the viewport of Bellwood Station's observation deck, watching the slow wheel of the Reach's nearest sun. The Assembly will not accept a report whose conclusion is that we cannot meaningfully influence this species through resource control. That conclusion has implications for every trade agreement the ward currently holds with them. You will revise your assessment to identify actionable leverage points, or another auditor will be assigned to complete this evaluation. Kess stood at the viewport for a long time. She thought about the floor beneath Voss's boots in the workshop, steady through exhaustion and grief and the specific fear of watching a man's countdown run toward zero. She thought about Okafor's quiet certainty at Dunmore, and the 40 kilos of scrap alloy that had crossed 200 kilometers of space because one tired engineer trusted another tired engineer's judgment without needing to know why. She thought about the hand-drawn chart on Callaway's wall that nobody had built and everybody had added to, and she thought, unwillingly, about her own 30 years of service, built the same way, one small honest correction at a time, until it had become a shape she no longer fully recognized from where she now stood. She wrote back 4 words, and did not revise the report. The conclusion stands. Warden. The ward did not immediately reverse the ration. Institutions rarely reverse themselves quickly. Kess had learned across 30 years, whatever the evidence in front of them. But 3 weeks later, without ceremony, without acknowledgement that anything had gone differently than planned, a new trade notice appeared in the Kestrel Reach Supply Registry, restoring full Thren salt allocation to all 14 stations at the original rate. By then, 9 of the 14 stations had already switched to Okafor's compound-free design. The other 5 converted within the following month, not because anyone ordered them to, but because a station commander on the 10th station had visited Dunmore on an unrelated supply run, seen the design running, and asked, the way Voss had once asked Kess without quite meaning to, whether anyone had considered simply not needing the salt at all. Kess remained at Bellwood Station for the negotiation that followed, not because her assignment required it, but because Callaway had asked her to, and because she found, somewhat to her own discomfort, that she wanted to be present for it. The agreement that emerged over the following months was smaller and stranger than anything the ward's original integration framework anticipated. It did not restore the old dependency. It formalized something closer to a partnership. Ward engineers would have access to the passive heat exchange design, properly credited and properly licensed, in exchange for continued technical exchange with human engineering teams across the Reach. There were disputes over credit, disputes over licensing terms, one entire session that collapsed for 3 days over a disagreement about whether the design counted as a joint invention or a human one the ward was simply permitted to use. Voss, present for that particular session by written testimony rather than in person, had ended her statement with a line the ward's recording clerk apparently found difficult to translate cleanly, that she did not much care whose name went on the patent, only that nobody else's engineer ever had to watch a countdown clock over somebody they cared about again. Ossen resisted every stage of it, and lost every stage of it, because Kess had spent the intervening months building a case in the same patient, additive way she had watched the humans build almost everything else she had seen them do, one solid piece at a time, trusted by the next person, until the whole structure held weight it had no formal right to hold. The dispute was eventually resolved not by the assembly, but by Okafor himself, who submitted a single short statement suggesting the design be credited jointly to the engineers of the Kestrel Reach, with no individual name attached at all, on the grounds that no individual name had actually built it. The ward's legal office found this unusual enough that it required its own separate session to approve, since ward precedent had never before accommodated an invention credited to a place rather than a person. Kess argued for its approval on the simplest ground she had, that the request was, if nothing else, accurate. "You know what the strange part is," Calloway said to her, near the end of the negotiations, the two of them sitting again in the small office with the hand-drawn water chart on the wall. "If the ward hadn't cut the ration, none of this happens. Okafor's design doesn't get built. Nobody ever finds out the salt was optional." Ossen thought he was proving something about our weakness. What he actually did was hand us a reason to stop needing him for something we'd depended on for 9 years. "Does that trouble you?" Kess asked. "No," Calloway said. "It troubles me that he'll probably never understand that's what happened. Next time he doesn't understand something about us, he'll reach for the same lever again, because in his mind, this time, the lever worked. It just worked for us instead of him." Kess thought about this for a long moment, feeling the floor of the office, steady beneath them both. "I will make sure that is in my final report," she said, "whether or not the Assembly wishes to read it." The final negotiating session took place aboard a neutral ward vessel positioned at the edge of the Kestrel Reach, and Kess had insisted, against considerable internal resistance from her own department, that Reyes attend alongside Calloway and Voss, not as a formal representative, but as a witness. Ossen had objected to this on procedural grounds, and lost that objection too, though it took longer than any of the technical disputes had. "I don't have anything to add to the technical side of this," Reyes admitted, sitting somewhat awkwardly at a table designed for ward proportions, several sizes too large for him. "I move parts around. That's all I do." "That is precisely why you are here," Kess said. "The Assembly has spent 4 sessions attempting to understand how 40 kilos of alloy crossed 200 kilometers of space in 11 hours instead of 11 weeks. You are the only person who can explain that to them without it sounding like a conspiracy theory." Reyes considered this, and then, with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to sorting his manifests, explained to a room of ward officials exactly what he had explained to Kess in the supply bay days earlier. That he trusted the people who ask him for things, because they had never once been wrong about needing them. That the cost of occasionally being wrong was smaller than the cost of always waiting to be certain. Ossen listened to all of it with the particular stillness of a man cataloguing an argument he intended to dismantle later, and did not, in the end, dismantle it at all. 9 years later, Ilta Kess stood at the edge of a decommissioning ceremony on Dunmore Station, watching a technician remove the last operational Thren salt storage tank from the medical bay, unused for the better part of a decade, kept only as a backup system nobody had needed to activate even once. She was no longer a field auditor. She had spent the last several years in a role the ward's administrative structure did not have a proper name for yet, something between an advisor and a translator, explaining to newer officials, station by station, why the old assumptions about leverage and dependency no longer applied to the Kestrel Reach cluster, and why they were increasingly failing to apply to a growing number of other integrated species who had quietly begun studying how the humans had done it. Priest, the hull technician whose countdown had first brought her to Bellwood Station, was there for the ceremony too, grey now at the temples, no longer doing hull repairs but training the technicians who did. He recognized her across the room and came over, unhurried, the way people who have survived something together tend to move around each other. "You're the reason I'm alive, you know," he said, in a roundabout way. "If you hadn't kept coming back and asking questions, I don't know if the report ever gets written honestly, and I don't know if Ossen ever backs down." "I never did feed your cat," Kess said, and Priest laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and for a moment the 9 years between that morning and this one seemed to fall down into almost nothing at all. "I did very little," Kess said. "Dr. Voss built the solution. You survived it." "Sure," Priest said. "But somebody had to be willing to write down what actually happened instead of what was convenient to believe. That's not nothing, auditor. That's most of what actually changes, most of the time." Somebody willing to say the true thing even when the room doesn't want to hear it. Voss herself arrived a little later, older, greyer at the temples than Kess remembered, walking with the particular unhurried authority of someone who had spent the intervening decade training half the engineers now running the reach stations. She did not embrace Kess, which Kess appreciated, but she did stop and looked at the empty tank being wheeled past, and said nothing for a moment. "Feels smaller than I expected," Voss said finally. "The thing we were all so afraid of running out of. Just an empty tank now. Nobody's even looking at it." "Does that trouble you?" Kess asked, echoing, without quite meaning to, a question she had once asked Calloway in a small office with a hand-drawn chart on the wall. "No," Voss said. "I think that's the whole point, actually. The things that matter most eventually get to stop being dramatic. They just get to become ordinary. That tank used to be able to kill Priest by running out. Now it's scrap. That's not a small thing, Auditor. That's the biggest thing there is. It just doesn't look like much from the outside." Kess watched the empty storage tank being wheeled away, its surface dulled by 9 years of disuse, and thought about the countdown she had first seen above his cradle, 14 hours ticking toward zero, and the particular quality of the floor beneath Voss's boots that night, steady through fear in a way Kess had spent the following decade trying, imperfectly, to understand. She had come to the Kestrel Reach expecting to observe a species running out of something. What she had found, in the end, was a species that had simply stopped needing the thing it was told it couldn't live without, and had done it so quietly, so immediately, so entirely without asking permission, that by the time anyone with the authority to stop them had understood what was happening, there was nothing left to stop. The tank rolled out of the bay and into storage, one more object in an archive of things that used to matter and no longer did. Kess made one final stop before she left the Kestrel Reach that year, back at Bellwood Station, in the workshop that had been rebuilt twice and expanded 4 times since she had last stood in it. It still smelled faintly, beneath the newer equipment and the better ventilation, of the same sharp mineral odor she remembered from her first night there, and she suspected, standing in the doorway, that nobody had ever quite managed to scrub it out, and that nobody had tried especially hard to. A cluster of engineers she did not recognize, young enough that none of them could have been on the station during the ration crisis at all, were gathered around a work table arguing cheerfully over a problem she couldn't identify from the doorway, passing a badly drawn diagram back and forth between them, correcting it, arguing again. None of them noticed her standing there. None of them had been assigned this problem by anyone Kess could see. A problem simply existed, somewhere in front of them, and that, more than any order the ward had ever issued in 400 years of careful, patient, well-intentioned governance, had always been reason enough. She let the door close quietly behind her, and did not disturb them. On her way back to the transport that would carry her home, she passed the small office with the hand-drawn water chart still on the wall, updated now in a dozen different hands she did not recognize, none of them Calloway's, all of them adding, in their own small ways, to a structure nobody had ever formally designed and nobody had ever stopped building. She did not know who commanded Bellwood Station anymore. She suspected, standing there, that it no longer mattered quite as much as it once had. The ward would go on being the ward. It would issue other orders, test other species, assume other dependencies it had never bothered to verify were real. But somewhere behind her, in a workshop that smelled faintly of an old, ugly, indispensable failure, a species that had never once needed anyone's permission to keep reaching was already halfway to whatever it would need next.